Hi, hello everyone. Sorry that I had to interrupt this beautiful soundtrack. My name is Silvia Benedito. I'm associate professor here in the landscape program, but I'm also co-coordinator of the art design in the public domain with Krzysztof Wojcicko. It is with great pleasure to host and introduce James Welling tonight. And perhaps pleasure is a good word and an appropriate term to use for the discussion. Mr. Welling is joining us in the context of the Rouse Visiting Artist Program. He's the last in this series and perhaps the most intensely connected with what we do here at school, not only in projecting and fabricating otherly worlds, but also in working with the built environment and the very various layers in this world that we all inhabit, time, color, architecture, landscape architecture, light, memory, and the different publics as subjects and matters, and all of them in James' work, they coalesce in unsettling ways. Opening last year's program, or this year's program, we had Louisa Lambry, a photographer focused on the evanescent dimension of landscape and architecture. We had also Ivan Ban, a photographer particularly focused on the built environment and the ways that people inhabit the space that we fabricate and build. We also had Liam Gillick, a multidisciplinary artist known for its multiple collaborations with architects and also known for his own architectural installations. And now we are very happy to host James Welling, hoping to trigger everyone's imagination with what Sylvia Levin wonderfully described as an intoxicating qualities of the dense color field. The way that I read James Welling's body of work, and I mean literally a body with different parts, is that it's exploratory and without a pre-established end or result. Therefore, is in itself improvisational, but methodological and precise. Scenes are set as frames in which phenomena and the happenstance of the phenomena is taking place. In different words, James sets the context, the way that I read it, sets a context as platforms for larger questions to emerge and appear. Questions perhaps situated on an environmental, political, questions of translation and interpretation, and each photo is a question in itself. There is something also very visceral in James' photographic work, as they produce a simultaneous nausea, as if we are sugar-loaded, and attraction. Likewise, I like the idea of poisonous honey. Welling's works makes atmosphere appear as a thick medium in an uncanny and unpredictable manner, reminding us of the world and the air we live within. This thick medium, this atmosphere, coalesces and binds features of architecture, landscape architecture, and often the brutal structures. This one seem redeeming against their hosting environments. And the gradients of color present in the work of James Welling remind us that the air we breathe is made of various layers, densities, temperatures, velocities, and scents in its vertical section. As a big admirer of the avant-garde filmmakers, and we were talking about that, how I love the work of Nathaniel Dorsky and James Hyler, I see James' photographic work as a choreography of time and thickness, where the imagination works with incompleteness and where stories or impressions by different people are coalesced and accumulated, likewise a diary. And James has a work called Diary/Landscape. It's very beautiful. As mentioned, James Welling work is a body of many works, meaning that James began to work in watercolor and painting, being deeply influenced by Charles Bushveld and Hed Hopper. After this, James studied modern dance at the University of Pittsburgh, participating also in various performances. So this idea of performance and performative space perhaps gets also captured mostly in the photographic work of James. Associated with his projects on mobile sculpture, James worked with Super 8 films and later digital video, where he started also to explore existing infrastructure, factories, architectural features, and color as subject matter. He has worked and exhibited internationally from LA to London, New York to Basel, Hanover to Oslo, Vienna to Paris, just to name very few. He also worked at the Architecture and Design Department at MoMA, beyond, we were discussing, taught briefly at MIT, Bard College, and later he became the head of photography area in the Department of Art at UCLA. And here he embraced another medium, bringing another parts, this body of work, the photograms, working directly with film as a skin that registers light and process. And currently he's teaching at Princeton University. James Welling's latest exhibition was held at Chicago Architecture Biennale this year, curated by our faculty, Mark Lee and Sharon Johnston, dedicated to the topic, Make New History. He was also invited to photograph Chicago's fabric, in particular Mies van der Rohe's IIT campus and the Lakeshore Drive apartments. And I'm also very happy to know that he's currently working again in video as a potential new series of spatial explorations. Without further ado, please welcome James Welling.
Thank you for that introduction. It's a little intimidating to be here in the graduate school of architecture because even though I'm a big fan of architecture, I know very little about a lot of things. So tonight I'm going to talk about my photographs from how they emerge in my imagination and how I created them. And there are a lot of, I know there's a game called Chutes and Ladders, or wormholes. One thing will pop up 20 years later. And in my work, there's a lot of back and forth between different parts of that body that was referred to. I'm going to leave out some sort of big parts of my photographic oeuvre because I want to talk about this idea of pathological color, which is the title of a class I taught at UCLA and I'm now teaching at Princeton. And pathological color comes from Goethe's theory of color. He talks about the physiological color, normative color, and then in the appendix he has a section on pathological color, which for him is, it's color blindness or certain abnormalities in the organ of sight. I originally thought I would start out by showing my black and white pictures from the 70s, but then I realized that my first photographs that I made when I seriously committed to thinking of myself as a photographer in 1975, after spending undergrad and graduate school working in painting, video, performance art, modern dance. I committed to be working seriously in photography in 1975 with pictures like this, Polaroid photographs that I heated over a gas stove to get the intensity of that red. And this one, I refrigerated it when it was processing to make it the cold blue of the fluorescent lights in my studio even colder. And this hands-on working with color was something that I really enjoyed about Polaroid, but eventually I wore it out and moved on to black and white photography. I'm often referred to as a conceptual photographer, and I think that name has been attached to me because people, when they describe what I do, or don't really know how to deal with the kind of expanse of the different projects. But I'm very much interested in the actual making of photographs. And when I bought a view camera in 1976, I began to work with architecture, because for me the camera has a similarity to buildings. It's, you know, the front and the back, the rising front. This view camera was very very well suited to making architectural photographs. So without really knowing much about architecture, but being, I was very fond of these sort of generic stucco buildings in Los Angeles, where I was living at the time. I dragged my camera around on my bike and took pictures. This particular photograph, I'd read that a red filter would turn the sky dark. So I bought a red filter and was very excited. I made the sky kind of Ansel Adams dark gray. I was also excited to learn that if you open your lens for 2 minutes at f/16, you could make a photograph like this. And in Los Angeles, there are only two types of weather. There's day and night. You have sun, and then you have the unchanging streetlights. So I made a number of pictures by streetlight, which was it's great, because you just open the lens and you know, count to 120. This photograph, I particularly like the shadows, you know, the kind of stucco box shapes. And it was always in my mind somehow associated with what I thought of as the Bauhaus. Without really knowing much about the Bauhaus, it seemed to have something to do with architecture and light and space. I moved to New York shortly after that photograph, and spent a year kind of struggling, didn't really know how to deal with New York City. The city was very difficult to make 4x5 pictures in, so I went internal for a number of years, for 4 or 5 years, and made studio photographs. And this is a picture from a group of photographs that I started in 1980, continued for a year and a half. The photographs themselves are very small. They're 4x5 inch contact prints, and the architecture photographs of LA and the next two groups of work also were very small pictures. I was interested in that, a kind of very intense viewing experience, these scintillations of light, the kind of chaos and formlessness, but still very precise. So I like that tension between, you don't know what it is, it's actually aluminum foil, but it's still totally sharp and clear. So that tension between you can see what it is, but you don't know what it is, was something that I became very interested in. And this was about the time that the so-called pictures generation was forming. A lot of those practitioners were interested in using photography, but somehow critiquing it. And even though I tagged along like a sibling, I wasn't so much interested in critiquing photography as trying to understand what it was. And this was the architecture photographs in LA, and these pictures were the sort of foundational level of my thinking about photography, sort of photography ground zero. A related project, I took a kind of cheap velvet called drapery fabric and dusted it with pastry dough that you'd make baklava out of. Or in this case, I was working in a restaurant making shepherd's pie, some sort of pastry dish. And these photographs are, for me, still deeply mysterious. I know what I did, but I don't know what I was doing. Oops. But the important thing for me was the shallow space of these studio pictures, this kind of 1 or 2 feet deep. Also, a relation to product photography, photographing objects on a seamless backdrop. So this is Knox gelatin that I poured ink into. I was very surprised to learn when I was reading about photography that all photographs are composed of gelatin silver print. Even color paper has gelatin as the kind of binder or the medium. So I wanted to make photographs with gelatin, which I, tongue-in-cheek, call gelatin photographs. These are all black and white prints that I would make in the darkroom. At this point, color really wasn't an option. I didn't understand how color photography worked. I didn't know that you could go and rent a darkroom and make color prints. It was all something that was a lab did. So I was deeply involved in just thinking about photography as a black and white medium. While I was making those gelatin photographs, I got a job at the Museum of Modern Art as an art handler, and I worked in the architecture and design department. And when they discovered that I was a photographer, I was assigned to take pictures of design objects like this. This is not my photograph. I looked online yesterday, and all of the 80s pictures have been replaced by, this must be a new digital file. But I photographed this Olivetti computer. I also photographed a number of posters like this by I'm trying to remember his name, Beale. And occasionally I'd work in the Mies van der Rohe archive. And I photographed that Bismarck Memorial on top, although it's not my photograph, it's someone else, it must be the new digital version. And occasionally I'd photograph drawings when the archivist needed someone to help out with the documenting all the drawings. And this is, of course, the famous detail of the IIT corner. So working in the A&D department at MoMA, I looked in the files, and I became very interested in the architecture of H.H. Richardson. Growing up in Hartford and in the suburbs, you'd see a lot of Richardson or Richardsonian buildings. And I really wanted to get back out of the studio, so I purchased a book. The complete Richardson buildings had just been published by I think Jeffrey Orser, and so I got the book, and it had all the addresses. So I packed up my cameras and went out to. This is in Newton. This is the Emmanuel Baptist Church, University of Vermont. Ames Memorial Town Hall in Northeaston. This is actually a sculpture by or project by Olmsted called the Rockery, which is to me one of the great 19th century earthworks. So you just walk over this path, over this arch, and it gives you a view of Richardson's town hall in the distance. A Richardson project. It's not really. It was completed after he died. And then, of course, you all know this building. I I showed it to a friend of mine, Joel Wax, who was a councilman in Los Angeles, and he was like, he hated this picture because he had studied at Austin Hall. It's like, why would you want to take a picture of that? And then Ken and I visited this. This is the Stoughton House on Brattle. It's actually one house away from Philip Johnson's Ash Street house, which is kind of nice. The confluence of Johnson and Richardson, just separated by one building lot. In 1998, I became really interested in color. So I thought about it. I knew that there was something to do with the red, green, and blue sensors in our eyes. I discovered that in 1861, James Clerk Maxwell had created the first color photograph, and it was of a Scottish tartan. He used black and white film with some sort of glass vials with red, green, and blue liquids and photographed the tartan, and then did a slide projection piece to create his color photograph. So this idea of trichromatic vision, trichromatic sensors in our eyes, trichromatic bulbs in the projector, is the basis for all color photography. It's actually not how the brain works. The brain has hardware for red, green, and blue receptors, but when you actually get into it, it's much more complicated. But for the purposes of understanding how color reproductions are made, color photographs, red, green, and blue trichromatic structure is the basis for color photography. In 2005, I gave a lecture on Andy Warhol's shadow paintings, and I saw these paintings and Warhol's project, a painter, actually a photographer, who wants to escape the kind of red, green, and blue structure. For me, Warhol became an artist who was trying to get outside of that RGB, and the shadows were a way of selecting color, choosing color. And in the case of the shadows, Warhol sampled Fiesta ware, and that became his color palette. And in a way, this example of Warhol would come back later in some of my other projects. After giving that Warhol lecture, I had a kind of understanding of how I could make a photograph that diagrammed or demonstrated the RGB characteristics of color film. And I set up my view camera on a windy day in November 2005 and photographed shadows as they moved across these succulents. And I made 6 exposures, red, green, and blue, and just to be careful, I did cyan, magenta, yellow. So I call them hexachromes. So wherever there's color, that's where a filter was placed in front of the lens, sequentially 6 exposures on the same piece of film. Where there's no vibrant color, that's where the light was constant. So this was a big breakthrough for me in terms of sort of taking a knife and cutting into the sort of fabric of our color perception. And what that led to were a couple of assignments. One was to photograph, and this is not a picture of it, case study 1 or 2 in Los Angeles. It was going on the market, and a number of photographers were invited to photograph it. So I photographed Craig Elwood's case study 1 or 2 using trichromatic filters. And then I visited the Farnsworth house and used that same process of sequential exposures. And it turned out it wasn't very successful because there wasn't much wind. It was kind of, nothing was really changing. So I made some pictures like this and thought about the process. And then as I was studying these pictures, I received a phone call from the photo editor of New York Magazine, Jody Kwan, to photograph the Philip Johnson glass house. She had seen these pictures, and she was interested in someone to take pictures of the glass house, probably the most photographed modernist house in America, for the reopening in 2007 when it would open to the public. So I visited the glass house, realized that the trichromatic multiple exposure technique wasn't going to work with this. So I began to take the filters that I brought and place them in front of the lens and made pictures like this and this. The pictures were published, and then I went back for 3 more years photographing the glass house and the notorious lake pavilion, which is a kind of miniature temple. And the curious thing about working chromatically this way is that I would bring filters or diffraction gratings, and I would think of just very arbitrary colors to place in front of the lens, and then they have an emotional resonance. In the theory of color, Goethe talks about how blues are depressing when you look at the landscape through a blue filter, or it looks majestic when you look at it with a red filter. So there was this whole dialogue, of course, the Claude glass, where artists would look at the landscape through a monochrome filter to simplify the tones. So there's actually a large body of literature in painting around the use of colored filters, which I discovered when I was making these pictures. And I'd switched over to using a digital camera. These are all Canon 5D pictures. With few exceptions, these are all done in camera. No, as it were, Photoshop post-production, apart from just lightening the picture to print it properly. And what I enjoyed about working this way was I would set the camera up on a tripod and do dozens of variations, and then later choose the one that seemed like the most coherent. When I was visiting the glass house, I met someone who said to me, I own a glass house in Paris. It's called the Maison de Verre. Maybe you'd like to photograph it. So on a trip to Paris, I visited this house, which I guess it's very hard to get into. I remember as I approached the door, a couple of architecture students were waiting for the doors to open up so they could see it. I found the Maison de Verre very grim, very dark, and on the flight back, I didn't shoot it with filters. I photographed it the way an architectural photographer would render it. But on the flight back, I began to experiment with different color modulations. And so this project on the Maison de Verre became for me about taking the color in the file and exaggerating it or amplifying it, bringing it out using different, very simple Photoshop tools. Intensifying the greens. So this was a sort of subset within the Glass House project. I was still working on the Glass House. This is actually a very recent picture which does use layering and Photoshop alterations that were not in the original file. And for me, this was an emblematic picture that bringing a piece of glass to look at what was behind me was a way of building in multiple views into this picture, that it was about a kind of the immediacy of the experience to see behind me and forward. But I also realized that one of the characteristics of photography that's lost with the transition into digital is the inadvertent double exposure. Of course, now you can do that with a camera. You can set it for a double exposure, but it doesn't have the complete randomness that occurs when you run a roll of film through a camera that you shot 2 weeks ago. Of course, you can do it again in post, but I was very interested in what happens like this. When I finished the Glass House project, I wondered what to work on next, and the experience of working on the Maison de Verre, those techniques that I developed, directed me toward another project, and that was a project about the artist Andrew Wyeth, who is a sort of damned artist in American history, is kind of unclassifiable, notorious, figurative painter, who was very important to me when I was an adolescent. And when I exhibited this project, a lot of my friends sheepishly told me that they also had admired Andrew Wyeth when they were younger. It's sort of a dark secret. So in this project, I went and photographed the famous Olsen House, which is now owned by the Farnsworth Museum. But I began to make modifications. I cut down the trees on the left. I removed a pine tree from the front of the house. I actually went in September, and I was planning to go back in the winter, and I broke my foot and wasn't able to travel. So this is actually snow from the glass house that I shoveled, or my assistant shoveled and placed in the foreground of the Olsen House. So this project became not only about looking at the places that Andrew Wyeth had worked and mimicking some of, or doubling some of his paintings, but also creating things that hitherto didn't exist in the picture. And just amping up the color or taking it down. Or desaturating it. So in a way, it wasn't like I was treading water, but this project I knew I would not go and work on Edward Hopper's paintings, for instance. I would do something with what I'd learned. For me, beginning in 2006 with the Glass House and also with these Wyeth pictures, I printed my work with an inkjet printer. And it's my feeling that the Epson printer is a different medium than the analog chromogenic print or darkroom print. There's a kind of thickness to the pigment in the Epson print that I really enjoy, and it aligns the process of making a photograph more closely with offset printing. So even though this work is a sort of homage to a painter, and the surfaces that Wyeth recorded in his paintings, it's also about the printing process. As I was finishing the Wyeth project, I was invited to be one of 10 artists to take photographs of the Museum of Modern Art's sculpture garden probably because of my interest in Johnson and working on the glass house, I was able to actually see that this walkway across the kind of water was a sort of picked up from Johnson's front step. Or maybe Johnson took the stone from the sculpture garden and took it out to New Canaan. Either way, there's a kind of correspondence in a lot of Johnson's projects with other things that he was working on and how they come back to his house. In any event, I didn't feel that I was the type of person to go and photograph the garden. Tina Barney photographed the garden. Thomas Struth photographed it. Lorna Simpson photographed it. I wanted to work with existing archival pictures. You know, working at MoMA and the A&D department, I'd seen that the museum has all of these wonderful pictures from different events, projects that were done in the garden. So I went and looked through the archives and began to select photographs. This is Raphael Ferrar. It's ice sculptures that he created. It might have been for the Information Show in 1970. Okay, so I was working with archival pictures. Then I decided that I would go back to those same spaces with my camera and make my own pictures and then layer them on top of each other, perhaps. But what I decided to do, intuited, was that I could take the MoMA archival image, put it into the red channel of a color document, and take two of my own pictures and put those in the green and blue channels, and I would get a picture that looked like this. It would be a multiple exposure, that kind of inadvertent, random juxtaposition of three images on top of each other, and they would produce a color picture, 3 black and white photographs. This, of course, you know, echoes back to Warhol, Rauschenberg, artists who worked with colored channels, who worked with silkscreen, could the person who's taking the pictures, do you have enough? Because it's distracting.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I'd be happy to, you know, we can do it later if you want. Because it's, you know, the infrared sensor. Anyway, so Rauschenberg, a big influence when I was young, and this picture at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, he's using, you know, imagery on top of each other. Something else that I became very fascinated by as I began to think about the process of making the sculpture garden photographs was psychedelic photography. And I remembered these pictures by Richard Avedon. So I went to the Avedon studio and looked at the source images and looked at Avedon's dye transfers, how he tried to put it together. So this was also a kind of multi-channel, putting black and white pictures into RGB files. This is another Avedon project from the same period, Moondrops. When I was at the archive, the archivist said, you know about the Moondrop photographs? I said, no, I don't. So this is an Avedon project for Revlon. And then this is another Avedon photograph, similar era, late 60s. So these techniques, variously called color solarization, or this, equidensity film. The bottom picture, the back cover of Aladdin Sane, is the only example I can find of a strange film that AGFA produced in the 60s and 70s called equidensity film, which would make a color solarized image. Turns out it's used for astronomy. But the photographer for Aladdin Sane used it on the back cover. So with these references in mind, I got very excited about putting together 3 pictures into color channels. And when I look at these photographs now, they seem to me crude. I can see the RGB channels. They are not so transformed. But anyway, I proceeded along. I was very excited about what was happening. As I said, the inkjet prints have this thickness. So to me, the yellow in this photograph is as if it's been rolled on with a brayer. This was around 2014. And at the same time, I was printing a book of my black and white photographs, and I went to a printing company called Meridian Printing in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. And when you print a book, there's a lot of downtime. It's like 2 hours or 45 minutes to 2 hours between signatures, where they set up the plates and then they run the paper through, and then they call you when the presses are ready. But actually what they're doing when they're revving up the press for each signature is they're printing on top of other previously printed sheets to save money. These are called make-readies. And so on top of this stack of printed material is a make-ready. It's a superimposed 2 or 3 images on top of each other. It's a scrap sheet. My father, who worked in the printing business, called it usable scrap. But make-ready is a wonderful term because it inverts Duchamp's ready-made. You have the make-ready. A number of artists have used make-readies, like Dieter Roth, Walid Beshti, Susan Silton, have used them as works. But for me, the make-ready was a kind of inspiration. And I'm sure it inspired Rauschenberg and Warhol and other artists who've worked with, who've been in the context of a graphic arts factory. So I went around Meridian taking pictures and then slightly torqued the color so the blues and the reds popped out in unnatural ways. And for me, going to the offset printing plant was like going to the foundry or the forge of photography. It's where all the colors live. And a friend of mine who's a musician was talking about Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, and he said Beethoven's great because he uses all the keys in the keyboard. And with these new pictures I was making, I realized I was using a lot more color than you would use in a conventional photograph. So this is a small project that's kind of embedded in the sculpture garden. I went to the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford and photographed in the museum using archival imagery. And actually these are all archival pictures. I don't think they're any of my photographs. I was told this, it's working. Okay, more Wadsworth. So back to the sculpture garden. So this is a picture of a performance that Kusama did in 1965, where a bunch of performers took their clothes off and frolicked in the fountains. And as I looked through these MoMA archival pictures, I began to seek out performative images of dance or performances or music concerts. And partly because of my interest in remembering my 1 year I took studying modern dance, I became very interested in this picture. And I wanted to remake it, not use an archival picture, but I wanted to somehow recreate it. So I got some of my UCLA students, and they'd studied dance in the dance department, but they were visual artists. So I worked with them for 4 Saturdays, and we took pictures in the studio. And this is what I came up with. And let me show you the channels. So this is actually, the dancer is mimicking a Von Rainer image of an Yvonne Rainer dance in the middle. On the same camera card, I had started to photograph brutalist buildings by Marcel Breuer. This is the IBM Research Center in Boca Raton, Florida. So that was the red channel, the green channel is the dancer, and the blue channel are some other dancers from my UCLA group. And this is actually a small dance company, Los Angeles Contemporary Dance, and here are the source images. The middle picture is, I went to San Francisco, used my cell phone and photographed that department store that Frank Lloyd Wright designed in the 50s. I forget the name of it. And then the Breuer Research Center. And here is Paul Rudolph's Orange County office buildings before they were torn down. And this is the final picture. So I was thinking a lot about the idea of, somatic experience. Architecture and dance share the kind of interest in somatic possibilities. So I thought putting architecture and dance together seemed like a good fit. They also became stage sets. And not all of the images use architecture. The previous picture from Kyle Abraham, I just layered 3 images of the dance with some cutouts that I created. And this is landscape imagery with a French dance company doing Merce Cunningham events. CNDC Angers. And then I began to work with the Los Angeles Dance Project in LA. Rehearsals and some dress rehearsals. This was actually this year in July. So in May, I created a 1-minute video work called Metamorph for a show called Metamorphosis. And so this work, I took a lot of the outtakes and put them together, and I asked my brother to compose music for it. So it's 60 seconds long. So that was presented in Vienna on a monitor in a storefront gallery where you could listen to the music on your phone. Two years ago, Mark and Sharon Johnson-Markley invited me to be part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial. And I was excited. I asked to photograph Mies van der Rohe buildings, and I specifically asked to photograph IIT because when I worked at the museum in the winter of 1986, I went to Chicago to do a show at Feature Gallery and went out to IIT on a snowy day and took 35 millimeter pictures. So my participation in the biennial included pictures that I took in 2016 and 17, as well as photographs that I made in 1986 and a trip that I made in 2006. So I was able to almost take my own pictures as archival images and layer them together. I, partly as a result of the class that I taught at Princeton last year, I realized that I could recreate some of those techniques that Avedon had used for the Beatles and for Moondrops by taking the same file and placing an equidensity object or gradient map in between the two files, and that would color parts of the image. So I consciously tried to mimic what Avedon had done and others had done with this sort of channel mixing, where you would take a black and white file and process it or print it in color, and then print on top of it other colors outside of the RGB matrix, as it were, in a similar way that Warhol or Rauschenberg would take images, monochrome silkscreen files, and then squeegee different colors through them. I was also inspired by Raoul Ubach's bas-relief pictures from the 1930s and early 40s, where he would sandwich positive and negatives on top of each other. So in addition to using gradient maps, I'm using bas-relief techniques in the photographs that I produced for the Chicago Architecture Biennial. And this picture, the three channels, 1986, 2006, and 2016. I think these are, all three channels are from 1986, including the contact sheet in the bottom, which sort of, to me, mimics the structure of the windows. Also the three different years, Crown Hall, and then, of course, I couldn't help photographing the corners of the IIT buildings. I have to say that I worked with two different assistants on this project, John Louisa and Evan Whale, and they also traveled to Chicago and took some of the source pictures. And I've used other people on the dance projects. They'll shoot a dance performance that I can't get to, and then I'll work with the material. But it really, for me, it comes out of this working with archival imagery. So the Los Angeles Dance Project 2 years ago worked with two choreographers named Gerard and Kelly. And I met Gerard and Kelly when they were graduate students at UCLA in the interdisciplinary studio of Mary Kelly. And I was interested in talking to them about dance. They eventually came to creating a work called Modern Living in the Schindler House using LA Dance Project dancers. So this is Modern Living at the Schindler House. and then they created it at the Glass House. So it was this kind of confluence for me of a dance company that I already photographed and a site that I'd already photographed. With some kusama globes floating in the lake. And this is a picture that I made a few years ago. I put LA Dance Project in the Farnsworth House in 2014. And in 2017, Gerard and Kelly brought LA Dance Project, or some of the dancers, to the Farnsworth House. So this was 3 years later. This was a performance that took place in September. And then this is the last series of images. To show you a few of the transformations. This is how it started with this dancer, Julia Eichen, actually in the house with images of the deck. And then this is the final image. So that's that's where I've arrived. It's my most recent work. So I would be happy to entertain questions.
Thank you so much. Perhaps I can start. Goes back to, that's the position that I have here, so I allow myself to do that. There's issue of media and the techniques that you go as you experiment with media. If I translate that into architecture or to the work that we do in the School of Design, the issue of editing what we have done is a very important one. So perhaps I would like if you could develop a little bit this idea of editing. When do you know that it's too much? Or what are the criteria that you also set up for yourself, but the protocols that you set up also for yourself when you work with 3 layers, 4 layers, what you decide to show versus what you decide to hide?
Well, it's only with the dance pictures and the MoMA Sculpture Garden that I develop multiple variations. So it becomes, well, first it was inventing. Inventing is maybe too big a term, but creating a workflow to put together the layers to transform the color. Because for me, the goal would be to not to take it as delivered when you enter the pictures. It looks very garish and very ugly. So the idea of transformation or metamorphosis of the image. So where am I going with that? So it started out, 3 years ago, the process of working, and I only use a couple of different, tools in Photoshop. I'm not making any new tools. I'm using, and they're not presets, but I'm working with the software as it's been created. And then I'm stacking up different layers, turning them on and off. So it's a process of putting this flow together. But one of the things that I'm most excited about working this way is that it's unpredictable. And this is something that I find, for me, digital technology previously was about improving an image or removing something or taking blemishes out or removing telephone poles or all of the corrective ideas. But in this process, it's really about something completely unexpected. So the color palettes of the different photographs go in radically different ways, and they're ways that I don't understand. And that's the thing that is most dynamic about it, is that it'll go in one direction or the other.
On that note, I'm also wondering, thinking about the relation with the client. Definitely you have work, like for instance, the Biennale is more an abstract, it's a topical client. And it seems to me that the work developed during that phase and other phases that you have, they are more abstract, perhaps more to the point, more with less layering involved onto that, less apparent layering. When, for instance, I see the work that you are working with a client, it seems like it becomes also more graphically intense or more layered. And I don't know if was my impression, and I don't know, I'm wondering if the idea of working with a client that is a person that has also commercial objectives, very clear, versus other that is more abstract, also kind of starts to give you other directions.
Mm-hmm. I don't do a lot of commercial photography, not because I don't want to, but I just am not hired. But the project for New York Magazine was extremely liberating because my art director, the photo editor, said, "Do whatever you want. We want something that is totally does not look like anything that is going to come out at the same time." And the projects that I'm most happy with, or that I feel like I challenge myself the most, is when the client is gives me complete freedom. So that trying to think of examples of, the Sculpture Garden project. The client, the museum is the client. They chose some pictures. I don't think they chose necessarily the ones that I would have chosen, but they chose ones that were, featured the garden in ways that were important to be shown for the project. Yeah, but the client, I think this is the difference perhaps in the art world and your world, that there is less direct back and forth between the client and the producer.
I will open up to the audience. Any questions? Yes. You might introduce yourself.
My name is Matt. I live in Somerville, and I decided to come to this lecture. I have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to narrow it down to one. Did you prefer shooting, when you shot 4x5, slide film or negative film for color?
I shot very little color materials, negatives mostly. Is that important?
If you preferred slide or negative film? And,
Slides are very hard, challenging to,
Did you have like a lens selection that you liked, or?
I'm sorry?
Did you have a particular lens that you used, or? Now and then, or?
I like normal lenses. No, I don't know. I mean, it depends on the project. Today I was shooting with a wide-angle tilt-shift lens. When I started out taking pictures, I had no idea what focal lengths represented. I just grabbed the first lens that I saw. It's a very inexpensive Kodak lens. I could still use it. It's actually slightly wide. It worked really well, but there's a way that, when you go forward in the world starting out, you don't really know what these tools are. In a way, when I was younger, I had so much more energy to explore what this particular lens or this type of film represented, because it was absolutely, unknown to me. So, yeah. But I'm really not even though I may only talk about things that are technical, I don't really care about that in any important way. I am now able to financially buy expensive equipment, but it's absolutely meaningless in terms of, what the artist does.
Hi. Oh. Is it my turn?
Yeah. No, your turn.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi.
Wait a minute. We've got someone in back, Christoph.
Oh. You can go ahead, though.
You are referring to Warhol and Rauschenberg, but how about, I wonder if you have any dialogue with Dan Graham, with his glass pavilions and also video architecture?
Dan Graham was someone I met when I was really young, very young, and he introduced me to the idea of many architectural ideas, for sure. And his pavilions and the idea of transparency and mirrors, I've kind of erased Dan from my influences, probably incorrectly. But there's a way that Dan is about a kind of neutrality or transparency. I don't associate Dan's work with hallucination, or there's a way that the whole conceptual art has a kind of grayness to it, and that, at least for me, it may actually not, but that was the way I interpret it. So I had to go outside toward Avedon. I'm sure Dan had those Avedon posters in his room when he was growing up, but the history of color photography as it's understood today completely excludes psychedelia. And this is what I want to try to bring back, is the artists who worked with those processes. Rauschenberg and Warhol, of course, are very mainstream, but there are a lot of lesser-known photographers and graphic artists, book artists who worked with, Dieter Roth, being one of the better examples, who worked with a lot of these processes. So I'm trying to, bring them back. Yeah, question back here.
Yes. Hi. I'm Lucy Kim. I'm an artist and assistant professor of painting at Boston University. And my question had to do with the way you merge color in photography with images of dancers. And on the one hand, I'm really intrigued because there seems to be an interesting sort of contradiction where there's a reference to, not reference, but there's an expressive, there's a allusion to expressiveness, or it is expressive because of dance and the way the colors interact in your photos, and also physiology, so optics in the body. And I was interested in anything you had to say about that. Abroad.
I think dance is a special case of theater, where there's no dialogue, there is a kind of psychological dimension, but it's not embodied in the way that a photograph of a person on the street, or a tableau, or a setup photograph. It's a kind of special case, in the history of photography. People like Jeff Wall, or I'm trying to think of other, Paul Graham, or even street photographers. There's a way that the human subject is portrayed, and the viewer then reads a psychological dimension or narrative into the picture. So I realized that by working with dance imagery, I was not as bound by those psychological interpretive or intuitive or projections, and that I could work with the human subject, bodies, expressive elements, but I wouldn't be necessarily tied to a narrative. Of course, this is one of the things that Merce Cunningham brought in, was the anti-narrative in dance. I don't buy that as something that is the be-all and end-all of dance or expressive movement. But as a photographer, in my particular world, it was a way that I could engage with, human subjects, bodies, people, that wouldn't be read narratively. Yes.
Hi. Looking at that picture you've got on the screen there, have you ever felt tempted to go back to your earliest roots and actually start combining paint with the printed image? Because it looks rather sort of tempting to start playing with sort of washes and things over an image like that.
Oh, I think about it. But it's also, as one of the important ideas that I have to contribute is that the dialogue for me is not so much between painting and photography, it's between photography and graphic art, which is a lower art. One of my friends said, "This looks like graphics." That was like a criticism. Not to me.
Hi, I'm Hartmut Austin. I teach at Boston College. I'm also a painter.
Uh-huh.
How do you decide on the scope of a project? And I mean, when do you get tired of a glass house? Or
I think, I think for many artists, there's an arc to a project. When you start out, you make that first thing that's very exciting. Then you try to make another one, and then there's a complete abject failure. And then you try to figure out what it was about that first one that was actually, and so you kind of discern the rules of what this project would include. With the glass house, I went with film cameras, I went with slide film, I went with negative film, I went with video cameras, I made color prints, I went back in the darkroom, I tried to make darkroom manipulations, I tried everything. It turned out that there's only one path forward, and that was the one that I chose, which was working digitally and not doing anything in post. And then as long as then I kept going back with different materials, and there's a lifespan to most projects. I don't think I'm alone in this, where eventually you exhaust, there's no more, there are no more unknowns. And then I made video works at the Glass House, I made 3 video projects. And then it's kind of ended, but I have made a few new pictures using these equidensity processes. But it's over. And in a way, I think, projects run this sort of life cycle of discovery, understanding what it is, the rules, as it were, and then it concludes, for me. Okay. Well, thank you.